right, here we go. So it's psychedelic week. So the last week of the month, we're going to be doing psychedelic specific episode because we like psychedelics.
Yeah. Psychedelics are a big part of what we talk about day in and day out.
Right. And we're going to talk about considerations of ceremony, therapy, and recreational use, and the differences, and when to consider which, and things to think about.
Yeah. We're going to get into the details.
So let's start with defining these three areas, these three terms, so that people know what we're talking about. Some people know what we're talking about, others don't. So we have ceremony, therapy, and recreation. So let's start with recreational use, which is probably the widest use of psychedelics, would be my guess.
By far.
Yeah. Worldwide.
Yeah.
Right now, at least at this point in civilization, it's the widest use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, you're right. It's good to put it in a historical context where we think, at least the hypothesis is that psychedelics were confined to a ceremonial context for millennia in many different cultures, east, west, north, south, all over the world. We don't know that for sure, but it seems reasonable based on some of the things we do know, that there were elites in spiritual contexts like priests and so on, that shamans who took psychedelics, used psychedelics, healed people with psychedelics. But since at least the 1950s, and really the explosion was in the 60s, psychedelics escaped from ceremonial and even early research contexts into a lot of personal use.
When I would say one distinction as we kind of go through this, so ceremonial, it looks like there are sort of ceremonial religious uses over time, potentially. There's also indigenous uses that we don't know that they're always inside of like a ritual necessarily. We don't know, but it seems like there's definitely sort of a lot of ceremony going on over time, like with ritual, we should say, right? In the context of some kind of ritualistic spiritual holding, right?
Yeah. I think it would maybe be fair to say there was a sacred reverence for plant psychedelics that were available to certain people.
Right.
It wasn't always people sitting in a temple or a hut or in a formal ceremony. There were hunters who used microdoses of psilocybin, for example, to enhance visual acuity and so on. So, but in a sacred way, sacred relationship to the plant.
Right. And then what you're saying too, like turn 1950s, 1960s, we have an explosion where particularly a lot with LSD, psilocybin was used too in this explosion, among other things, but LSD was widely used in the 60s. And really like the boom of recreational psychedelic use really happens.
Right, definitely. And then there was a lot of fear, of course, about what the social and cultural ramifications could be of ongoing widespread use, and people really deeply questioning the Vietnam War and some of the other structural themes in culture in the 60s and 70s around racism and empowerment of women and so on. And so the counterculture movement became associated with psychedelic use. And then Richard Nixon put the kibosh on everything.
With the Controlled Substances Act. Was that 1970?
Yeah.
Right. And then we start to see psychedelics slowly fading from that level of use recreationally, still being used. And then we also see some more and more psychedelics are available over time recreationally, right?
Yeah. And then in the 1970s, I guess, let me back up a step and say, throughout this whole arc from the 50s until today, of course, there were still traditional indigenous uses, going back millennia that are ongoing, that some people, including you and me and other, lots of other people, have had the privilege to have opportunities to sit in those ceremonies over time. But then came along Sasha Shulgin in the 70s, who was a chemist who synthesized more than 200 new psychedelic compounds that no one had ever seen or heard of before. He also synthesized MDMA, which had been synthesized before back in 1912. And so he and his wife and their inner circle of friends took it and felt that it was probably going to be really useful for therapy, and started inviting their friends who were therapists to try it out and start using it with their clients. And it became widespread as a tool for therapy well before it got put on DEA Schedule 1 in 1985.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me also zoom out for a second. I think what I'm seeing is we're sort of crossing the three categories. So recreational, being however people define that, you take it with your friends, or you're at a concert, or out in public, either to have fun or maybe to have a big, profound experience, but for recreation, essentially. But we also, so that's recreational. Therapy is using the psychotherapy modality paired with psychedelics to have a psychedelic therapy session. So what we sort of skipped here, but we should say, is this whole thing that happened in the 50s and 60s, recreationally, there was also a movement with research in the 50s and 60s that also went away. That was going into the psychedelic therapy, more clinical dimension of looking at how does this help people with mental health struggles and things like that.
Yes.
So we actually had sort of an interesting kind of parallel process happening here. As psychedelics were coming, there was a clinical aspect being looked at, as well as a recreational pathway. And then, like you said, always the ceremonial / indigenous pathway has always been there. And then both of those, the therapy and mostly the therapy gets the kibosh really with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, where now it's hard to do research because now everything's Schedule 1, and then eventually MDMA gets on that schedule in the 80s.
Right.
And so psychedelic therapy research really disappears for a while recreational use is still happening, but not as prolific as the 60s and early 70s, but it's happening, right?
Right. I mean, the severe criminal penalties for possessing and distributing, using psychedelics definitely deterred some people, but a lot of people kept using psychedelics. But because they were on Schedule 1 and they were portrayed in a lot of government propaganda, frankly, as being as dangerous as things like heroin and cocaine and amphetamine abuse and so on, I think a lot of people who maybe would have tried it in the 60s didn't do that in the 70s. But as you said,
Right.
It continued underground.
Right. So now we go mid 80s. MDMA is also now Schedule 1. Very little psychedelic therapy research. Recreational use is not that big. Like maybe you knew somebody in the late 80s and early 90s that did psychedelics. Maybe it didn't. I did, but that was the 90s when I went to college. But also not a lot of people were doing it where I went to college. It was still sort of kind of fringe. And then we, have, of course, MAPS, Rick Doblin, starting to make some headway of let's get back to psychedelic research for therapy with MDMA, starting to try and make that movement, and then really takes off in the 2000s, where we really start to see research again really proliferate. And then we come to now, where you have these three different pathways. You've got actual psychedelic therapy with ketamine, potentially. That could be kind of a legal avenue if It's done correctly to be legal. We have other medicines hopefully going to have an FDA approval one day for therapy. It's actually pretty popular right now that you see a lot of recreational psychedelic use. And then there's this concept of ceremony, and we should unpack that more too in the current, climate of psychedelics, what that means. And so here we are. So let's just talk about currently. We've sort of defined, I think, what psychedelic therapy is. It's this, paired with psychotherapy, where you're working on yourself, mental health stuff, or maybe personal development, but it's with a therapist. And then we know what recreational use. Let's talk about ceremony right now. What's ceremony right now? Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably should start with, how the facilitator is trained might be a good place to start.
Yeah.
When I think about ceremony, I think I take a more conservative approach to defining that, where to me, the facilitator would be deeply trained by a tradition that didn't start in the facilitator's own backyard, last week or a year ago. The tradition started somewhere where people held the wisdom of that lineage for millennia, and there are legitimate holders of ceremony who have deeply studied with good teachers. And then there's kind of a neo-shaman movement where, I try not to be judgmental, but I think a lot of people, mostly with positive intentions, are stepping into facilitating what they call ceremonies without a whole lot of background, without a whole lot of training, where they haven't been tested, in terms of dealing with difficult situations, with a lot of hands-on supervision and, the development of that capacity to be a loving, connected, not intrusive support for people. So one thing is the training of the facilitator. I think the other one is what's actually going on with the intention of the facilitator and the participants. Typically the intention is different from a psychedelic therapy session.
Right.
I think those are the two main things.
Yeah. And I think I think ceremonies often in groups. Doesn't have to be, but it's often in groups.
Sure.
And sometimes there's ritual inside of the experience by the facilitator or shaman, or I think, like you're saying, if it's an intact ceremony that's been passed down from a lineage or an indigenous lineage that has its own, unique set of things that you'll see. Could be everything from, healing practices during it and singing and
right,
prayers. I've seen it, all of that. And it could be everything from never talking, where it's like there's sort of an unspoken rule. You're not supposed to talk at all during ceremony. Some you can, but it just depends on where you end up there. And there's also a lot of, I think in the ceremonial circles, there tends to be a lot of trust on the medicine doing the work. The intention of like going in and the medicine's going to do the work and with you, versus like having an external therapist there that's going to help support you in some way. There's sort of less of that externalization of having someone to support you, typically.
I think
from what I've seen.
Yeah. I mean, there's just one nuance I would add to that, which is that, at least in the ceremonies I've been a part of, the rituals and the ceremonies, the songs, Shipibo tradition, the Ikaros, the songs, healing songs, purification rituals with water and so forth and so on. The whole thing, the whole enchilada is considered to be the healing agent that where I've been. And so then the medicine, the sacrament, what you put in your mouth, whether it's peyote or psilocybin or ayahuasca or whatever the plan is a helper inside of that context, but
Yeah.
there's much less of a focus versus, say, psychedelic research on the molecule is the answer, right? You ingest this compound and that's the whole thing.
Right.
Much different.
And there's also tends to be different frameworks on what's happening in some, like, a more of a ceremonial space versus a therapy space. I mean, a therapy space, there's a westernized psychotherapeutic philosophy embedded in the whole thing, even if it's still different because we're working with a psychedelic, and there's still this philosophy of mind and ego and trauma and mental health disorders, and there's this whole embedded thing inside of psychedelic therapy. Whereas in ceremony, it depends where you're coming from and who you're working with, but it could be an energetic, metaphysical philosophy of, like, we're clearing the space, of different types of energies, and right. It could be that you're working with the spirit of the plant,
right,
as well. So it's like even though some of that might kind of bleed into each other here, there is some distinctions of just that sort of philosophical piece coming into it, and that kind of context and container, which sets one up for different experiences.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is critical, is that, the human psyche, like the parts of our inner psychological world, our thoughts, our emotions, if you want to go into like a Freudian frame, like our superego, our ego, our subconscious id, it's like you're coming to therapy and you're bringing something that needs help. You're bringing your kind of broken down psychology into the mechanic shop, and the mechanic's going to put some fresh psychedelic oil in your engine and help your engine get back on the road again. Like, that's the model,
right?
In a way,
or you blow a new gasket. It just depends on the day, but yeah,
it could happen. But the nature of what suffering actually symbolizes in a human being is a different symbol in a spiritual or a ceremonial context. That, again, speaking only from my own experiences of those contexts, what I've seen is human suffering is not about having a broken psyche or an engine that needs fresh oil. The suffering comes from all kinds of what you might call spiritual illnesses, or disconnections, that maybe you feel disconnected from your family. Maybe you feel disconnected from the environment, or from what you might call divinity or spirit or God or the universe. And there are other kinds of ailments that are, so to speak, treatable through ceremony, through the eyes of a different framework. So even just the nature of, like, what does the symptom, let's say depression or anxiety, mean? Like, what does it mean? And so then what are we going to try and do about it inside of the framework? It's a totally different setting and framework.
Right. And, if you're doing psychedelic therapy, hopefully you're working with someone that has a pretty wide framework. Because, any of these frameworks can get narrow for an individual human being, right? Like, these are all just frameworks that were created by humans. And there were other terms before that were similar presentations, right? So, but these things matter, right? When we come to the table, let's say if we're coming as a person whether we're going into recreational use therapy or ceremonial, like, what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about mental health and what we believe about the mind, like, psychedelics are gonna sometimes amplify all of that, all those beliefs, right? In any of these settings. And that's where I think it's teasing out these settings is so key. Because, like, you go into a recreational setting and you're like, oh, I'm just taking this with my friends to, like, have this great experience with the music. And, I want to, and then all of a sudden you're starting to, like, be in a crisis there. You're standing in, a crowd of 10,000 people. and you're all of a sudden it feels like the world's like actually crashing on top of you, and you're panicking, and you're like, oh my God, I'm broken. Like something's wrong with me. And it's like all this amplification's happening in that setting. And so that setting can be great, and people have great experiences in those settings. And there's a risk in that setting, which is you might see something about how you see the world, or how you see yourself in a setting that may not be the best place to actually learn about yourself and for the first time in that way.
Right, for sure.
I mean, it happens, but
yeah. Or you could even just be having an experience like at a concert, like you said, for example, where all of a sudden your personal point of view melts away, and you're having like a non-dual, no personality, nobody, like not just whom am I, but what am I,
right.
And these experiences, when they happen inside of a setting where you're safe and you have trusted people that you can connect with, who can hold you in that, it can be incredibly beautiful and transformative. And it can also be really frightening. It can be frightening even in a therapeutic setting or a safe, quiet, somebody's home kind of setting. But the kinds of folks that I think you and I have seen who have PTSD from a psychedelic, usually it came from having it in a setting where there was no support, there was panic. Sometimes law enforcement was involved because of weird behavior that was panicky or frantic or whatever.
Totally. Could be the wrong type of support was available.
Yeah.
It could just been a hard session, but that's, I think, even more rare if you had the right type of support. But, you can leave, a little fragmented, but with the right support, you have somebody helping you through that. Right. Yeah. And so that happens. And, I wouldn't recommend anyone does psychedelics for their first time in a recreational setting. I think that's a setup. Maybe it goes great and you have a great time. But I think I personally would recommend, if someone has never done psychedelics, like get a little, get some either therapy or a good container ceremony that like feels right to you under your belt, where it's like you have the right support, because you don't know what you're going to see or feel before you start, experimenting with settings that have very loose boundaries and loose containers. And so, I wouldn't recommend people do that first as a recreational experience. I think it's just you're rolling the dice a little bit more there.
I agree. It's pretty risky. I think there are, when I was at Burning Man, I only went to Burning Man once in 2017, but incredibly transformative experience. And one of the most transformative moments for me was I was sitting on an art car, on the roof of an art car, and I was with a couple friends. And off to my right, there was a little circle of like 8, 20-something-year-olds, young kids, like 22, 24, something like that. And they were all about to take psychedelics together. And I saw them. It kind of broke down my framework around recreational use. So I just want to offer this as an example of how sometimes therapeutic use and recreational use can have a little bit of a blend.
Right. Where it may not be recreational anymore.
Yeah, these kids were incredibly responsible. And, they went around the circle. Everyone had some kind of psychedelic in their hands. And what are you journeying with tonight? What's your intention?
Yeah.
How can I support you tonight? Where do you think you might get stuck with that intention that you just shared? It was incredible. It was like, oh my, this is like peer therapy, essentially.
Yeah. I think that's probably not recreational use, right?
Right.
It's definitely not taking the medicine just to have a good time and have no support. And I think that sounds very intentional and kind of bleeds into this ceremonial therapy kind of category. Yeah. So that happens too. I'm just flashing back. No pun intended. I was at a Steve Miller Band concert in 1998 or something.
Okay.
On LSD, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I'm sitting there and like, first of all, I'm all scared and freaked out and with my friends, and they're all dancing, doing the Steve Miller thing, like waving their arms, and and then I'm like sitting there, and I see this big, like 6'5" bald guy just like running toward me.
Uh-oh.
And I'm like, what's gonna happen? And he just like is running right at me, and he runs right past me and keeps going. And then for the whole rest of the concert, I was just flashing, seeing myself as like Kermit the Frog biting his nails, like scared the whole time. And that's like all I kept seeing who I was. And I was just in this nightmare of Kermit the Frog. So there's, the recreational thing can go sideways, is all I'm saying.
Yeah,
but
no doubt.
The therapy thing, I think there's a different framework here. Like it's like the therapy thing. It can go hard.
Yeah.
It could go really hard like that, where you're like, you can panic about your therapist. I mean, that happens. We've seen that.
Yep.
You start thinking your therapist is your enemy, not here to help you. That could happen. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had a session once where I thought the therapist had poisoned me.
Yeah.
And
well, they did. It was just a bittersweet poison.
Yeah, it took I guess it did. What is the difference between poison and medicine? Is the dose? Is that what they say?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely over my head, but it was by far the most transformative experience I've ever had in a therapy situation. I think what we're getting at here is that psychedelics open a door in your mind into territory that is already there. It's like we have I think in visual metaphors a lot. I think of it as like this kind of almost like a fairy tale landscape where like there's a castle and there's like a scary fire swamp down here below the castle, and
right.
Dragons and monsters around. And when we sit inside our conventional mindset, our usual reality, we're inside the castle. Everything's cool. There's fresh bread being made. Nobody's throwing catapults over the wall. Everything's fine. Maybe get anxious and somebody, hits you with a catapult ball or something. It's anxiety from the ego standpoint. I'm being attacked. But what happens, what's so good and bad about having a psychedelic session is you might be taken away to the fire swamp and left there for hours, and you're dealing with rodents of unusual size and these jets of fire that come up and scorch you and stuff. And so I think this is really important because it kind of illustrates the integrative perspective that you and I kind of founded the Institute on, is that a person who's well is a person who kind of has the capacity or the willingness, let's say, to be as uncomfortable as you get when you go into these scary places in your mind, while at the same time recognizing that, you know what, I'm the whole territory. I'm not just the castle. And ordinary states of consciousness, like the one we're in right now, I don't know if you're on a psychedelic, but I'm not.
No, God, no, I'm not.
Okay.
I hope I'm not.
The ordinary states of mind, if you've never been out of your mind, so to speak, then you don't realize that there are these scary places in your mind that already exist inside of you. And each time that you kind of set foot outside the castle, you might get really scared and really, freaked out and think that something's attacking you. When in reality, it's just like you're getting a breath of fresh air from whatever's going on outside of what you think is you.
Yeah, and then if we go another step here is the difference between ceremony and therapy. You may have a therapeutic experience in ceremony. You may have a ceremonial spiritual experience in therapy. Mm-hmm. But one thing that's typically different is the training of the leader, the facilitator in the room. And that, I think, matters when we start thinking about the complexity of mental health that someone might be dealing with. Understanding that complexity can often help guide people if they're going to do psychedelic therapy. There's a lot of ways to hold it so that you can reliably produce better outcomes is the best way to say it.
Right.
When people have complex mental health situations going on. And that's where ceremony may not be a good fit. It depends on what that person is dealing with. But, if they have a lot of complexity in history there's a lot to consider. Everything from medications they might be on to their aftercare, to the trauma that might be coming up and how to work with it and not recapitulate it. And there's a lot there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the limitations, let's say, of traditional ceremony is the absence of this psychological nuance that you're talking about, of how intense and how complex trauma, for one thing, can be. And as you said, people can get re-traumatized. I mean, they can go further out. They can get more dysregulated. If they have a complex mood disorder that hasn't been identified, then a serotonin stimulator, like any of the classical psychedelics, can really spin you out a lot further.
Right. So I think there's benefits and drawbacks to any way you go here, obviously. And, like you and I have had amazing ceremonial experiences, life-changing.
Sure.
Things that I'll remember for the rest of my life as positive. And I've also had problematic experiences. And so I think it's just, there are obviously pros and cons in however you're working with psychedelics. And because you and I are mental health educators, obviously we have we probably know the most about the mental health part of the endeavor.
Right.
And so I think there are really fairly safe ways to do a psychedelic therapy experience for people with mental health conditions, when it's indicated, to actually have a great outcome.
For sure. Which is not
reliably.
To say that, reliably, and is not to say that, I think it's also important to point out that when you undergo psychedelic therapy, you can have a very difficult experience. It doesn't mean you're having a bad outcome.
Right.
Sometimes, as in my case personally, the most challenging sessions can lead to the most transformation in your life, but it just might take a lot longer to get to the other side of that.
Right.
It doesn't mean that someone gave you the wrong psychedelic or that they didn't do the session correctly or something like that necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, psychedelic therapy, it's interesting. I mean, from a research perspective, we're looking for outcomes of symptoms going down. And that reliably happens, is what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Obviously not always. There's no miracle, medicine here. But that does reliably happen. But what you're speaking to is that's not the only outcome that could lead to a positive outcome over time, because there's also the disruptive element of psychedelics, right?
Sure.
Disrupting the entire internal experience that you've been stuck in, putting a wrench into it. And sometimes that's really even more uncomfortable for a moment than what you were in. Now it's like you're in this thing and you're stuck, but you knew what you had, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you're really stuck and it sucks and it's horrible. That's a different thing. But like, let's say it sucks pretty bad, but you're just getting by. You're like, well, I could just get by. It sucks. I hate it. But then you put a wrench in there, and now you're like really scrambled for a little while.
Yeah.
Those experiences often, with the right support in a psychedelic therapy context, lead to a rebuilding that's way stronger than what was prior.
Right. Yep.
Often.
It's like a scrape off of a home and building a new home from the ground up.
Yeah.
Which is really hard to do. And, can, as you said, I mean, it can lead to the most incredible positive outcomes. But you're not going to get there if you abandon the remodel, where there's just a raw foundation there and there's no house on top.
Yeah.
or just a blown up house.
Yeah. And then I think coming back to something you said earlier, ceremony is a fantastic way to go, particularly when you're seeking something spiritually. And maybe you're not so complicated with your mental health, which probably doesn't exist, but let's just pretend it does.
Well, there's a spectrum.
There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum. Maybe you're not that complicated. And you're relatively stable is another way of saying it. But you're really seeking spiritual experience and a connection, and that's where ceremony can really shine for people, right? And for some people, ceremony becomes a spiritual path, right? Sure. They're in a church, they're in a Native American church, or they're in a Ayahuasca church, and they go to church, right?
Right. And I mean, that's a good segue into an update about our friend Joe Tafur, who, is a physician who also spent a great deal of time in Peru training under a traditional shaman there, and who recently won a case for religious freedom to use ayahuasca as a sacrament at a church in Arizona. So these things are happening, and in other words, there are above board, legally sanctioned settings where ceremony can occur in the U.S. It's not common.
Right.
It's not common.
You've got a couple of places for ayahuasca. You've got Oregon passed through the Supreme Court. Was it Oregon or Washington that the ayahuasca church went through their Supreme Court?
Yeah,
that was a while back. Which ayahuasca church was that? Do you remember?
It was the UDV.
UDV, right?
Yep.
And then Joe Tafur is an example. There's probably some others, and then also there are some others that are using the precedent of that to as a church. They're actually a church, and they use that precedent with ayahuasca to say that they can do this. And then, of course, you have peyote in places.
Native American church. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you have now other things happening with psychedelics. We just get outside of even the ceremonial context. You have plenty of cities that have decriminalization going on for psilocybin for personal use, essentially. And then you have state measures like Oregon and Colorado, where you actually have psilocybin services happening, and Colorado's even potentially more expansive with their Natural Medicine Health Act. So there's quite a bit happening. And then with psychedelic therapy, we have ketamine as a prescription, and there's ways to do that. And then we have some medicines hopefully down the line here in a few years. So lots changing, lots happening in terms of the legal landscape.
Yeah, it's an ever-evolving setting, and it seems like it's going faster and faster, it seems to me, every year.
Yeah. Sometimes psychedelics will do that. Well, we could wrap up here, maybe.
Sure. I think we've had pretty good exploration here today of the headlines, if you will, the overview. There's so much more to talk about. We'll get into more nuances in future episodes around psychedelic therapy.
All right. Talk soon.
Thanks.